Battle Ram is one of the weirdest cards the Clash Royale developers have ever concocted. You take one of the slowest units in the game, make them carry a ram, and have them run as fast as a charging prince. It's fairly easy to counter, but if it connects while charging, you're gonna be in serious trouble. It's certainly no Hog Rider clone. This card's interesting design has led to some pretty innovative decks, helping underdog cards to thrive, and even taking part in pioneering a new archetype. And in 2024, this card received its own evolution upgrade. So many iconic decks would not exist without Battle Ram. So let's go over all of them, talk about the balance changes it's received, and explain how it ended up where it is today. Although initially revealed in December 2016, Battle Ram would not officially be obtainable in-game until February 3rd, 2017 through a special challenge. It was a building targeting troop that moved at a medium movement speed, but would increase to very fast, which was twice as fast after moving 3 tiles uninterrupted. Sort of like Prince and Dark Prince, but it took half a tile more to initiate that charge than the Prince's. Once the ram crashed into something or was destroyed, it would leave behind 2 normal barbarians. This second layer really helped it to stand out from other charging cards since it was almost like a shield. No matter how much damage was dealt to the first form, those barbs would spawn with full health. You obviously wanted the ram to crash into the tower, and if it connected while charging, it would deal twice as much damage on impact. The fact it had barbarians at all was going to make it a bit trickier to balance though, because this troop was present in 2 other cards. When you buffed or nerfed that troop, it affected all 3 of them. Another interesting tidbit was that this card was immune to knockback, which was a huge advantage over Hog Rider. Opinions were pretty mixed on the power level of this card. Some players believed it to be a solid balanced win condition, but others believed it was way too easy to counter. The statistics suggested this card was pretty bad though. By the end of the February season, not even a single top 100 ladder player was using it. It just didn't feel like the ram had enough, and since it targeted buildings, a lot of troops were able to easily deal with it, unlike the princes, which would fight back. But as players kept playing around and experimenting, Ram's true potential would soon be realized. Even with no balance changes, it would have a massive upsurge in March in 2 popular decks. A new card, the Bandit, would come out in March, and following its release, this high-pressure Battle Ram Bandit deck would make waves. You're gonna see Bandit in a lot of popular Battle Ram decks. When it comes to playing Ram, you had to be patient because it could quite easily be countered, but if the opponent was down on Elixir or you supported it right, this was one of the best punishing cards since it moved fast and dealt so much damage on that collision. On its own, it was a worse Hog Rider, but when you have these cheap, high-pressure decks, the opponent gets overwhelmed, and even if they're a second late dealing with it, they already lost 20% of their tower. You were also seeing Battle Ram appear often with 3 Musketeers. In fact, in the March season, the most popular 3M deck was a Battle Ram deck and vice versa. They went from being severely underused to being pretty popular thanks to the Battle Ram. Both cards were considered to be below average up to this point, but together they formed a powerful combo. You see, 3 Musketeers were good value since you were getting 3-4 Elixir troops for 9 Elixir, but there was never really a situation where you needed 3 Musketeers at once, which is why they were underused. But you could split them to pressure the opponent, and usually the 1 Musketeer was supported by something small to force the opponent to respond to both sides. And Battle Ram turned out to be a great support for that solo Musketeer. But why was it better than something like Hog Rider? 3 Musketeers were very vulnerable to big spells, but Battle Ram wasn't. If you clumped up some Musketeers with the Ram and they used a spell on it, you would still have those 2 barbarians that really couldn't be ignored, and it was especially good against the lightning. If you placed your Battle Ram on top of your 3 Musketeers and the opponent lightninged, it would absorb all 3 shocks. Even though Musketeers were clearly the more valuable troop, barbarians had a little more health than them, which caused the lightning to focus on them. So if you could block that spell, your opponent was not only down 2 Elixir, but wasted their best counter to your 3 Musketeers. The combination of high pressure and spell resistance made it a perfect synergizer. Pretty much anytime you saw Battle Ram, you saw 3 Musketeers, and vice versa. And this was just the start. The combo appeared in the #1 top ladder deck for the month of April, and not only was it still #1 in May, but 20% of the top finishing decks were 3M Battle Ram decks alone. But in June, you started to see it appear in other types of decks. Although 3M was certainly still #1, the June season showed that Ram had some utility outside of it. You saw it in PEKKA and Golem, but more interestingly, the #2 finishing deck of the season was similar to the Bandit spam deck that was popular back in March. However, this version didn't have the miner in it, which meant there wasn't a secondary win condition to support the Battle Ram in this deck. Ram seemed pretty unreliable on its own, so it was almost always seen with another win condition, but this deck proved that you didn't always need one. This deck was actually the start of a new emerging archetype called Bridge Spam, and you played it exactly like the name suggests. You spam high pressure cards at the bridge. The 3 main ones that were essentially the trifecta of these decks were Night Witch, Bandit, and of course Battle Ram. The fact that decks like these were thriving goes to show the meta was not in a healthy state. Spamming random cards to the bridge and getting consistent wins against all other archetypes was not the vision of Clash Royale, especially when cards like Night Witch, a card that moves at immediate movement speed and isn't even building targeting, are considered a bridge spam card. But thanks to this, plus the support of Three Musketeers, Battle Ram rose to being the 5th most used card in the game. Even with the rise of bridge spam, 3M was as popular as ever. The new Goblin Gang and Heal spell were great new synergizers, allowing the archetype to evolve nicely. It was crazy that a card considered bad a few months ago was now considered one of the best cards in the game with no direct balance changes. Even going into July, 5 months after release, Ram was still in its vanilla state, which is rare for any card. Supercell was definitely taking note of Battle Ram's rising prominence though. July was the 4th straight month of Three Musketeers and Battle Ram being in the #1 most used deck in top ladder. They were such a dominant duo that at least one of them had to be nerfed. And since Three Musketeers was one of the hardest cards in the game to properly nerf, and Battle Ram had the higher usage anyway, it's no surprise which of the two the devs decided to nerf in August. On August 11th, 2017, Battle Ram would receive its first balance change. Its initiative range was increased by 1 tile, and the time it took for the Barbarians to begin moving was increased by 0.2 of a second. Since the Battle Ram in its first stage moved at 1 tile per second, this meant it took 1 additional second to begin charging. This balance change was a bit controversial for several reasons, one being that it was felt that Ram wasn't the problem in this meta, but another being it felt like it was mainly meant to please highly competitive players only. You see, the Battle Ram's biggest competitor, Hog Rider, had a high amount of usage in top ladder as well, and a very high usage rate in lower arenas of ladder because it was simpler to play. Almost everyone could agree Battle Ram was a solid card regardless of trophy range, but to some people, Hog Rider was way too prominent, and Battle Ram being as strong as it was prompted some healthy diversity. It's very rare for Supercell to balance cards in accordance to the mid-ladder meta though, so like it or not, these nerfs were coming. But even in top ladder, following these changes, the balance between these two sprinters became worse. Battle Ram definitely felt a lot weaker. The only deck you were really seeing it in was Three Musketeers, but even in that it was beginning to phase out as a lot of 3M players were subbing Ram out for Dark Prince or Miner. It seems like the nerfs went a bit too far, but Ram still needed some time to settle before applying any future changes. For the rest of 2017 though, Ram's place didn't change much. Its use rate hovered around 6 to 9% in top ladder while maintaining a minor presence in Three Musketeers and PEKKA. The next time we saw any kind of notable development was in February 2018 when the Dark Prince got buffed. This buff not only helped 3M Ram, but also supported bridge spam decks where Battle Ram was the sole win condition. The rates didn't go up much, but the card was in a solid, healthy position. It worked well in a few different decks, but it wasn't flooding the arena. So it would be a bit odd when this card received a rework in June 2018. The Barbarian's hit speed was decreased by 1/10 of a second, but now it would be vulnerable to all forms of knockback. The Battle Ram didn't need this, but it wasn't really about the Battle Ram, it was about multiple other cards. You see, even though Ram was doing just fine, every other Barbarian related card, including the new Barbarian Barrel, was suffering in competitive play. Supercell was just trying to help those cards out, and Battle Ram's Barbarians had to be adjusted for consistency. Obviously doing this on its own would have made Battle Ram stronger when it didn't need to be. But why did they choose to take away its knockback immunity of all things? That seems a little over the top for a very slight hit speed buff. Supercell explains that it was for consistency because Barbarians already took knockback and Battle Ram was essentially 2 Barbarians. This charge would help cards like Mega Knight and Bowler be a much better counter, which was needed because this meta was filled with charging cards that didn't take knockback. Separating this card from the Princes a bit more would lead to some more diversity in counters. Now, there was a reason to include Mega Knight or Bowler in your deck. This change would also indirectly buff the Barbarian Barrel, because unlike the Log which knocked back anything, it could only knock back vulnerable units, and since it was so bad, an indirect buff was good for it. Not to mention, another knockback dealing spell, the Giant Snowball, will be released just a few weeks later, so preemptively giving it some more utility would help diversify the small spell field, which was also a priority at the time. So yeah, this change was less about Battle Ram and more so about everything else. But how did the card perform after this? Well, it didn't seem to make too much of a difference, but it's hard to tell exactly because only about 2 weeks later would Battle Ram get another balance change. This again wasn't really a direct focus on Battle Ram, it was a consistency change. Supercell was standardizing the minimum range to dash or jump as well as the charge up distance of every card in the game to 3.5 tiles. For Battle Ram, this was a half tile shorter. Following this buff, there was a major rise. The 3M Ram combo was as strong as ever. There were so many popular Three Musketeer decks ruling the game in late 2018, and nearly all of them had a Battle Ram. It was definitely the superior pick now. And on top of that, a new bridge spam deck with the PEKKA and Battle Ram was becoming absurdly popular. Both of these archetypes were rising fast, and with Ram so prevalent in both of them, its rates were skyrocketing as well. By early January 2019, it had officially risen to become the second most used card and most used troop card in Grand Challenges. So it's no surprise that Supercell would direct their attention on this card in the next round of balance changes. On January 7th, 2019, Supercell would nerf the Battle Ram. The reckless changes they applied to this card in 2018 for the sake of other cards was finally coming back to bite them, so they had to focus on it directly now. Obviously, they couldn't just revert all the changes they made in 2018 because that would mess with the other cards they were fixing then, so they went with a new approach, which was simply decreasing the Ram's impact damage by 11%. Nothing special about this change, it's pretty straightforward. Notably, it now dealt the same damage as a Ram Rider, which is probably how they decided on the exact number. This change made practically no difference. Remember, the Battle Ram only gets one hit unlike most troops, and most of the time it doesn't even get that hit because as a defender, you're gonna do everything you can to make sure that connection doesn't happen. After the nerf, it was still one of the most used cards in the game. PEKKA, Ram, and Three Musketeers were as strong as ever, and they needed Battle Ram. The nerf may as well have never happened. Going into February, Battle Ram would avoid the nerf hammer, but one of its best synergizers, Three Musketeers, would not be so lucky. They received a devastating nerf, instantly making every deck that included them irrelevant overnight. Knowing how well the two cards worked together before, it's no doubt that this hurt the Battle Ram, but Bridge Spam continued to thrive, which ultimately kept it alive and healthy. In fact, it was still a little too healthy. So in March, Battle Ram would appear in the balance changes again. This time, it was a 13% hit point decrease to the Barbarians. Now, although the main reason for this change was due to a rework to the original Barbarians card, this change was also tailored to the Battle Ram because this nerf meant that they now officially had less health than a Musketeer, meaning lightning blocking Musketeers with a Battle Ram no longer worked. Obviously, this didn't really mean anything right now because, as I stated, Three Musketeers were nerfed into oblivion. The combo didn't need another nerf. But Supercell had already stated they were going to buff Three Musketeers again at some point, so preemptively changing this interaction was helpful to ensure this combo wasn't so dominant again. Plus, Battle Ram was generally strong, so I'm not going to pretend this nerf wasn't deserved just for the sake of toning down its power. Although I stand by this change being good, it did garner some backlash. This is where I feel like the video turns into the history of PEKKA Bridge Spam, because that's pretty much exclusively what you see ramming from here going forward. Okay, I'm exaggerating a bit, but obviously with Three Musketeers out of the way and it only receiving nerfs, it wasn't exactly going to be thriving in any new archetypes anytime soon. However, it being used in Bridge Spam only wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It's okay for some cards to have one specific purpose, and it's not like it was just this classic PEKKA Bridge Spam deck going around. There were a few other ones popping up in 2019 that garnered some heavy usage. Battle Ram was the heart of the archetype, the main thing that allowed for this style of play to be possible. It had a special function, so it wasn't going to disappear overnight from a few light nerfs or one synergy disappearing from the meta. At least, not yet. The rest of 2019 is a bit of a roller coaster for this card. Even though it would get no more direct changes for the rest of the year, the environment would have some radical shifts, some of which heavily favored Ram and some that didn't. The first one of these shifts would come in August 2019 when PEKKA received a huge buff. With that buff, it obviously helped carry PEKKA Bridge Spam and thus Battle Ram. Although the rates for Battle Ram were very good in August, you'll notice it's not quite as high as a lot of the other Bridge Spam cards. The main reason for that is because Ram Rider was replacing Battle Ram in a lot of prominent Bridge Spam decks as they served similar functions, and it certainly had some advantages. It was infringing on some of Battle Ram's potential usage, but it was clear Battle Ram was still the better choice if you knew how to use it. The problem was that some people didn't know how to use it. Ram Rider would attack troops, including air units, while moving and had more health than the original Ram, but it lacked that second layer and cost one more elixir. It was mostly down to your skill level and preference, but it would definitely be a concern for the future. Battle Ram's place wasn't absolutely guaranteed. There was an adequate replacement ready to go if the meta demanded it. Although Ram was still doing just fine after the inevitable PEKKA nerf in September 2019, it took a sharp downward turn in October 2019, hitting its lowest low pretty much ever, which wasn't caused by anything directly related to Battle Ram, but rather the general environment. Beatdown and minor cycle decks were flooding the meta due to some poorly thought out balance changes and a new card. Mega Knight and Bomb Tower were appearing frequently as a result, which Battle Ram had a lot of trouble getting through. It would return closer to normal in November 2019, but wasn't quite reaching its summer rates. PEKKA Bridge Spam was enduring a new wave of popularity with the support of Magic Archer, and that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. There were no significant developments in 2020, but Battle Ram's prominence was a bit all over. You'll notice a downward trend in the first few months of the year. By this point, it was almost exclusively seen in PEKKA bridge spam, so it was on shaky grounds. But this deck would remain very strong, so it at least had a place. At least until April, where we would see how much Battle Ram truly relied on this one deck now. You see, in April, Magic Archer received a huge nerf, wiping it out of the meta overnight, which meant classic PEKKA bridge spam was severely weakened. You saw some players trying to replace it, but the deck didn't perform nearly as well without it, leading to Ram's rates plummeting alongside the Magic Archer, suggesting it wasn't really viable. Luckily, Magic Archer was back the next month after they fixed him, which brought back PEKKA bridge spam and therefore Ram's rates back up. But this really exemplifies how much it was relying on this one deck now. If any of these cards got a major nerf and there wasn't something solid to replace it, Battle Ram wouldn't have a hope. Even when Three Musketeers made a small comeback during the summer of 2020, Battle Ram wasn't seeing play in anything besides PEKKA. They just didn't synergize as well anymore thanks to the Barbarian HP nerf. For the remainder of the year, nothing really changed. It was performing about average, still seen in this one PEKKA bridge spam deck. The only other deck that rose to some notable level of prominence is this PEKKA-less bridge spam deck with Cannon Cart in October. And although it was actually pretty popular in Season 16, it never saw much play after that. You just saw less PEKKA in general this season in particular because there weren't really any tanky ground win conditions appearing, and if there was, they usually had Fishermen to deal with it. So this deck was a nice adaptation to the Season 16 environment. But even with this season that seems to heavily disfavor PEKKA, classic PEKKA bridge spam was still the most popular Battle Ram deck. It was nice to see that it can be successful in other decks given the right circumstances though. For the remaining 2 months of 2020, the rates had trickled down, partially thanks to some nerfs to the Electro Wizard. 2021 was very stagnant, not too much to go over. Classic PEKKA bridge spam was still very popular in the beginning of the year, but around June, you started to see the archetype heavily adapting around Battle Ram. Ram Rider was starting to become a popular replacement again, and after the Goblin Drill came out, you saw some new bridge spam style decks rise up, and even classic PEKKA bridge spam straight up replacing the Battle Ram for Goblin Drill reached the top deck list. It was actually an extremely good year for bridge spam, but all the newer variations excluded the Battle Ram. For most of the year, it was hovering right around 3 to 4% usage with a 50% win rate. So it wasn't dead or anything, but really bad when you consider this was one of bridge spam's best years. It did have one small development in October 2021 after the Archer Queen was released. Archer Queen was integrated into PEKKA bridge spam, and that variant kept the Battle Ram, at least until the Archer Queen was emergency nerfed a few days later. Ram had felt like it had been teetering on the edge of needing a buff and being just fine for a long time now. The rates were always about average to below average, but it was consistently seen in PEKKA bridge spam and PEKKA bridge spam only, and only in one variation, aside the one that replaced Poison for Fireball. It would have been nice to see it buffed so it could be viable in other decks, but the problem was that if you buffed it, it would help PEKKA bridge spam even more, which it did not need. Considering these facts, it's understandable why when the Battle Ram received a buff in December 2021, players were a bit divided. That's right, in December 2021, Battle Ram's damage was increased by 8%, a partial walkback of the January 2019 nerf. This was a nice buff for bridge spam players, however, some people were questioning why they were doing this when bridge spam was doing just fine already. I get that argument, but Battle Ram had not appeared in any decks outside of that one for more than a few weeks in years, and even then those variants were never as popular. This deck was 2 years old, 3 if you include the older variant without Magic Archer. Even though this was undoubtedly beneficial to the card, it made virtually no difference. As I stated before when talking about the January 2019 damage nerf, changing the Battle Ram's damage is not going to make more than a drop of difference because most of the time the opponent is not going to let it connect. But even if it did connect, the damage increase was unnoticeable. Just to give you an idea of how small this was, the difference of damage from a Battle Ram before and after this buff when connecting to a building was less than half of what a zap deals to Crown Towers. I get they didn't want to buff it too much because it was already viable, but this change may as well have never happened. Although you did see a small rise in the first few months of 2022 thanks to this new Rising Queen bridge spam deck, it disappeared very quickly after the April 2022 Archer Queen nerf. With things remaining stale in 2022, Supercell decided to give the card another buff in June. This was a simple 1/10 of a second hit speed reduction to the Barbarian troop. A very small buff, but more helpful than increasing the Ram's damage. Once again though, this change made virtually no difference in the card's performance. It was just a nice change that would benefit the card in a few rare situations. Skipping ahead to December, minions received a nifty damage increase, which led to the old classic PEKKA bridge spam variant making a mini resurgence, which meant this month you had 3 variations of the same deck reaching the top deck list. And this minions variant would continue to see some play going into 2023, so Ram's rates were actually pretty good in January. Things would remain remained fairly stable as usual until June 2023, where we saw the introduction of card evolutions. These evolutions would help specific cards by giving them major upgrades, but none of the bridge spam cards were getting any yet. So in modes where evolutions were available, Battle Ram's rates were taking another hit. For years up until now, PEKKA Bridge Spam had not been the most popular deck, but always on that top deck leaderboard. However, since it was finally slipping off, the devs no longer had to worry that a buff to Battle Ram would make that deck game-breakingly overpowered. Bridge Spam really needed help now, and Battle Ram especially needed help, so it was a no-brainer. This buff would come in August 2023. The original work-in-progress change was just to decrease the distance required to charge down to 3 tiles. Charge-up distance for all charging units was standardized to 3.5 tiles in 2018, but Prince and Ramrider had already been destandardized 1 year prior, so this change made them consistent again. And this is exactly what it was at the card's launch back in 2017. I'm guessing they probably wanted to implement this change when they were applying it to those other cards, but because it was still succeeding in that one PEKKA Bridge Spam deck, they decided not to then. Players were generally happy at the announcement, but of course there were some sticklers. I don't think anyone disagreed with the notion that Battle Ram deserved a buff. I think it was more so that evolutions were causing a good number of previously healthy viable cards to be irrelevant, and so few cards were receiving balance changes at all that it seemed biased to single out the Battle Ram specifically. Regardless though, this change was probably not going to do much on its own. It was really easy to shut down the Battle Ram in the current environment that a half-tile charge reduction was not going to make up for the radical shifts that had been disfavoring it. After listening to player feedback, the devs decided to increase the Ram's health by 6% on top of the charge range reduction. It was a lot, but it was going to need a lot to convince players to use it in new decks. Like most Battle Ram changes, there weren't any significant interaction changes. It would just allow for more tower connections in close scenarios. This buff was certainly more beneficial than the last two. Following this change, you saw a new variation of that Archer Queen spam deck that was popular earlier in the year, but now with arrows as the small spell and evolved barbarians instead of elite barbarians. Now that this card was more reliable, it was able to succeed in decks like this without another secondary win condition again, which was good because PEKKA wasn't really viable at this point. This deck surpassed Classic PEKKA Bridge Spam's popularity, which is the first time a different Battle Ram deck surpassed Classic PEKKA Bridge Spam's usage since the death of Three Musketeers, assuming you include all the slight variants as one. But although it seems to be on a good path, things would take a sharp downward turn in November following the release of the Little Prince. Not only was Little Prince a tough counter to Battle Ram, but Bowler rose a lot in usage to counter the Little Prince, and since Bowler was a hard counter to the Battle Ram, it really didn't have a shot in this environment. High-pressure charging cards, especially the ones vulnerable to knockback, were simply unviable in November thanks to this. As the meta developed, however, you did see another rise in December thanks to a modified version of PEKKA Bridge Spam that included the Little Prince and new evolved archers. Unfortunately, this variant wasn't popular for long, dying out quickly after the Evo Archer and Little Prince nerfs in January 2024. Battle Ram would continue to have small rises and falls. Despite the August 2023 buffs, it was struggling to stay relevant. It had another minor downfall in February 2024 thanks to the addition of a second evolution slot because, as I mentioned before, very few of the existing evolutions helped Battle Ram out even a little bit, so putting more of them into each deck would not work in the card's favor. Luckily though, things would turn around again in March. PEKKA would receive a major buff, and the Zap spell would receive an evolution, which was the first card in PEKKA Bridge Spam to receive one. So just like that, once again, PEKKA Bridge Spam was back in yet another new form. It was nice to see that Supercell wasn't just letting this archetype along with Battle Ram rot as they so easily could have done. And things were going to get even better, because the very next month, Battle Ram would receive an evolution of its very own. That's right, it was finally Battle Ram's turn, and it was getting a significant upgrade. It wouldn't really receive any stat buffs, but it got two brand new notable abilities, the first one being a damage aura. Battle Ram normally could never do damage to anything in its first form except the building it connected to, but now while it was charging, it would deal damage and knockback to anything in its path. And I mean anything. Even the heaviest ground troops would be knocked back a full 2 tiles if a charging evolved Battle Ram collided with them, and the damage was enough to take out anything up to a goblin. The second ability was that now Ram would no longer die as part of its attack. It would crash into buildings ad infinitum until it was taken out. This evolution made would-be solid counters like high damage low HP swarms and Tombstone useless against it. And if all of this wasn't enough, the barbarians weren't normal barbarians. They were evolved barbarians which had 25% more hit points, allowing them to survive a fireball or even tank the lightning if placed on top of musketeers, as well as receive a 2-second 35% boost to movement and hit speed per hit. it. You had to play the regular Battle Ram twice to cycle to this, but apparently originally it was going to be a one-cycle evolution. That was changed pre-release due to creator feedback. Even though this was a significant upgrade, you have to remember this was competing with a bunch of other evolutions for 1/4 of the deck. Regardless, the Battle Ram evolution instantly had a place in the meta. It was almost exclusively still seen in PEKKA Bridge Spam of course, but thanks to the PEKKA buff from last month, it was fairly popular this season. What was interesting though is that even though Battle Ram was one of the few cards from classic PEKKA Bridge Spam to have an evolution, a lot of new variations of that archetype were using Ram Rider and other evolutions instead of Battle Ram. In fact, some players were still using the regular Battle Ram with PEKKA and opting to include better evolutions like Knight, Zap, or Bomber in those two slots. So although at first glance players believed this was going to be game-breakingly overpowered, it ended up not making too big of a splash on launch. It actually seemed a little underwhelming. Part of this is due to the Dagger Duchess's prominence. The Ram evolution just came at a bad time because Dagger Duchess pretty much forced everyone to use heavy beatdown decks. Siege was also starting to rise with the assistance of Evolution Tesla, and Bridge Spam decks historically have had a disfavorable matchup against that archetype. Despite PEKKA decks usually being effective against beatdown on defense, the Dagger Duchess made most PEKKA Bridge Spam decks terrible on offense. Something like Bandit plus Battle Ram alone could effortlessly get shut down with the assistance of the Dagger Duchess. You needed to build traditional pushes with a building targeting tank in the front. A PEKKA buff plus a Battle Ram evolution was simply not enough to overcome the Duchess dominance. Which is why despite this deck getting a major PEKKA buff followed by a Battle Ram evolution, it wasn't PEKKA Bridge Spam's time to shine. But before we could even see the meta calm down and return to a sense of normalcy, Evolved Battle Ram would receive a rework in May. And I use that term loosely because it's really just a nerf as it was meant to be. The biggest change was that it would no longer knock back heavy units in order to allow cards like Mighty Miner and PEKKA to be more reliable counters. Supercell doesn't really explain why they did this, they just say what effects it would have. For some greater context, Supercell was nerfing every single card evolution in the game except for one, so it wasn't as bad as it sounds. They were decreasing the general power level of evolutions. Now I'm sure you're wondering why I called this a rework when that's clearly just a nerf. Well, Evolved Barbarians were receiving a rework, and since they shared a troop, it affected both cards. Their health was decreased by 17%, but now each hit would grant them an extra second of boost. They still had more health than normal Barbarians, so the main interactions would stay the same. Anyway though, the nerfs definitely outweighed the buff. However, since every other evolution was getting nerfed too, Evolved Battle Ram would still perform about the same after the changes went live. Duchess was still ruling the meta in May, but you did see the new evolution Wizard working well in PEKKA Bridge Ram this season, of which the non-evolved Battle Ram was used in. In most decks where there's cards with evolutions, the evolved version was used, but you weren't seeing that a lot with Battle Ram because in most situations, evolved Battle Ram didn't do better than a normal Battle Ram would have, especially after losing its ability to push back heavy troops. Heavy, air, and ranged units would counter it the same as before, and these were usually the primary counters anyway. You had a zap in pretty much every deck to deal with swarms, and most buildings were still pretty effective counters. And even though it could connect to the tower infinite times, it was very rare to get more than one connection per deploy. This is unlike the majority of evolutions whose abilities provide extra value in almost any situation. In the top 100 finishing decks of the season, 4 of them included Battle Ram, none of which were the evolved version. The fact that the normal Battle Ram was outperforming the evolved one was very unusual, as very few cards outperformed their evolution counterparts. June 2024 would change things yet again though. The Goblin Machine and Goblin Curse were added, which were more new cards the game would revolve around for a while. But more importantly, this update would come with balance changes that would indirectly nerf Battle Ram. The Ram Rider's required charging distance would be decreased by 1.5 tiles, which meant to begin charging 1.5 seconds faster than the Battle Ram, making it a more appealing option. So if you were still using regular Battle Ram, you would probably want to switch to Ram Rider now. After the meta stopped being Goblin Machine Mirror Cycle a couple days later though, things settled out in an interesting way. Normal Battle Ram continued to see some play as the Goblin Machine was integrated in, but the most interesting deck I saw gain significant popularity was this PEKKA deck that included Evolution Battle Ram and Ram Rider. I'm pretty sure those two being used in a top deck together was a first, but although this deck was popular, it wasn't the dominant variant. Most PEKKA decks were only including Ram Rider, since multiple charging cards that targeted buildings in one deck was a bit redundant. Fortunately, with Duchess, Ram Rider, and Evo Wizard nerfs in July, Evolved Battle Ram became a better option, so in the next couple of months, you saw some Evo Battle Ram decks reaching the top deck list and a significant improvement in use and win rates. But that still wasn't the end, because in September we would see the PEKKA evolution. This was another strong evolution that became much more preferable over the Evo Battle Ram. Taking a quick stat from September 8th, Evolved Battle Ram was in 3 of the top 200 decks, whereas regular Battle Ram was in 8. A stark difference from just the previous month. And that's pretty much where Battle Ram has remained. It's in an interesting position where the evolution isn't that good compared to other evolutions, but it's still a solid card nonetheless, which leads to the evolved version only being used if there's not another available card with an Evo in the same deck. And that's becoming rarer and rarer considering new ones are added every month. The PEKKA Evo just helps to prove that. It's certainly come a long way from being a Three Musketeers shield. Despite being far from its peak, I like where it is and think it's still a healthy card. I always wondered how Supercell came up with the idea for Battle Ram, especially as to why they chose a slow troop like Barbarians of all cards to be its base troop, but I gotta admit, it's a creative card that adds a really fun dynamic to this game. The way it goes from a high pressure offensive card to 2 average Joe Barbarians definitely helps it to stand out from similar cards. I feel like it stood out best with Three Musketeers when its second layer was utilized to help decrease some of the vulnerabilities 3M users faced when it came to spells, unlike nowadays where it can just be subbed up by a Ram Rider in most situations. The last thing I wanted to go over was a few interesting tidbits about the Battle Ram's history that didn't quite fit in the middle of this video. More specifically, a balance change that was very close to being applied but never was, and how this card was intended to be on release. The Battle Ram's first balance change came in August 2017, but did you know it was originally planned to receive a change in June 2017? That's right, and it was actually going to be a buff. It was going to change so that cards with a lingering area attack wouldn't be able to hit the Ram and Barbarians with a single attack. So things like Bowler and Log wouldn't be as efficient against it anymore. The card didn't really need a buff at the time, but it makes logical sense. However, this change was not pulled back due to balancing reasons. According to Supercell, it was because of a bug. But even 7 years later, splash damage can still double dip on the Battle Ram. Interestingly enough, Goblin Giant has a similar mechanic, but you cannot double dip against that. So it seems like they can do it if they want to, but at some point they consciously decided to keep the interaction the way it was for Battle Ram. Another interesting thing to know is that even though Battle Ram was immune to knockback for over a year since its release, it was actually vulnerable to knockback prior to its launch, only being changed the day before it was available in game, which looking back retrospectively was clearly a mistake. But one thing I thought would be cool is to apply this to Battle Ram's evolution, but only have it immune to knockback when it's charging. Battle Ram is viable in today's meta, but the evolution doesn't see a lot of play. If no direct action is taken, I think it's just going to get worse over time as more evolutions get added, so it would be nice if it had something to help it stand out from normal Battle Ram in more situations. Unless they just had more evolution slots, but I don't think players really want to see that anytime soon, and by the time they do, there may be so many evolutions that it may still not matter. Let me know what you think should be done with the Battle Ram, if it's fine the way it is, or if it deserves a little more help. Also let me know which card's history you want to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.